Welcome back, everybody, to the Land Between the Meadows Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're continuing our county by county history. And today I have with me Daniel Hopkins. He's here to bring us some great insight on other things about I'm losing my thought there, but he's going to help us, I guess, with this history of Rockcastle.
Yeah, so this is Jameson. I appreciate you letting me set in. We did the episode 1 of Rockcastle County. As if they listened the first time, they probably know I'm from Garrett County. I don't really have any connection to Rockcastle County other than, living close by and knowing you. But I do have a few relatives that are buried there. But I'll try to add a little something to it here, and hopefully I can contribute in some way.
All right, thank you again for helping out. It's good to have somebody else to talk to. But as we talked about, or at least talk to about this stuff, because it's good to have a good connection to your county and so forth. We're all a little bit biased to our home counties. But last time we talked a lot about just kind of the laying the groundwork to Rockcastle County. The people coming in and kind of getting the first houses settled up. We know that a lot of the land was given by Revolutionary War land grants, and that's kind of one of those things that I went back, of course, and read some more, and I was like, man, I need to mention this stuff. And
so when we finished the last time, we were sort of, you had those early explorers that were coming in. The Revolutionary War was kind of going. I don't know if we got to the end of it or not, but I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it tonight. You had those people coming in, and the listeners think that it was just, millions of people. You talked about it last time, but when does Rockcastle County officially be a county, James?
So it officially becomes a county in 1810, but people have been rolling in. It was originally part of Lincoln County, and then it was part of Madison as well. It was broke off between Pulaski, Madison, Knox, and Lincoln.
So Lincoln was the county starting officially in 1780. That's roughly when the war is ending, mid 1780s. So it's still about a 30-year period after the war or maybe 20-year period after the war when Rockcastle County officially becomes a county. But that some of the rules about becoming a county in those early days, you had to have certain populations, right? Mm-hmm. You had to have enough people sort of to demand it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we see with these people coming in, and especially these soldiers coming in, as they kind of boosted that population to where there was a legitimate need for Rockcastle County.
Yeah, and that's the way it goes as people came into Kentucky, the counties the population got bigger, so the counties began to get broken up and become smaller and so forth. But I wanted to go back, because every time we do these, I always just find something else. I was like, man, I should have mentioned that. And so I found some more things I kind of wanted to mention before we got into, per se, Mount Vernon specifically, but just about the county in general. So I found a list of Revolutionary War vets that got land grants, and these were people that did come to Rockcastle, and they did claim their land grant. And these names, I'm going to read them off here, and you're going to be able to say, I know these names, and especially if you're listening from Rockcastle, you're going to know somebody at least with one or two of these names. But you had Abney, Allen, Anderson, Baker, Bates, Chastain, Denny, Dysart, Ferris, Harlow, Houck, Lawrence, Pugh, Ramsey, Sigmund, Stevens, and Sweeney. And these were some of the first ones that came to Rockcastle and claimed their, I wouldn't necessarily shouldn't say first ones, but the names of war vets. But one I didn't mention was Cash. There was a guy named William Cash, and I mentioned this one separately because this is my direct ancestor. William came over here with his land grant. He had a son, William Jr., Stephen, Josiah James, Jim, which they also called James Isaacs, Albert Andrew Jackson, and then Alma Jean. And Alma Jean Cash is my grandma, and Jack Cash was my great-grandfather. I was able to actually meet him. He was alive when I was wee little lad. But
really,
that's a connection that connects you to my ancestors who were in Rockcastle when it became since it was a county.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you can see, you're 10 generations straight down the line right there.
Mm-hmm.
But like you mentioned, like there's a handful of names that you rattled off there that are just in my mind, Rockcastle County names.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked this before, but I've been involved in athletics, in the school for pretty much my whole life as a player and then coach, and now and teaching, administration, and all that. And like when you play Rockcastle County, like those names that you rattled off, those are the names that you still see. And so those kids may not even know it, but their 10-time great grandfather has been living pretty much in the same county, and those names still exist. And like you said, Cash being William Cash, your 9-10-time great grandfather, whatever the number was, when I hear the name Cash, I think Rockcastle County. So, and every county has those handful of names that are that same way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's just one of those things that I guess when you, and I can get into my genealogy for another episode, but you look at those ancestors, and it really kind of brings you closer to that county or your home to say, my people have been here 200 years. That's right. That's a lot, and it really kind of connects you, to your roots, I guess you could say. But anyway, we talked about these early travelers and these early traces. Skaggs Trace was the main one from Rockcastle that was first labeled or named, if you want to say it like that. You had the river and so forth. But I wanted to talk too about some of these documentations of people coming through Rockcastle during the Revolutionary War and some post the Revolutionary War. And you can take these comments positive, negatively, however you want to say it. But in 1779, George Rogers Clark had captured Governor Henry Hamilton, and he was led through Rockcastle, and he talked very complimentary of the scenery, how beautiful it was, but he also talked about how rough the terrain was. And again, you're talking about Rockcastle, who, west side is kind of hilly, so forth, but then you're starting to get into the mountains as you go east in the county and into some rough terrain. But why were they going through this area in the first place?
So that's for me.
That's for you.
Well, as we, talked a little bit last week about, what prompted some of the settlers to move into Kentucky, was a little bit of, I guess we would call overcrowding in Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. And so the British, who ostensibly controlled everything from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, obviously didn't care for those, didn't really like the Americans moving in there. Of course, then you've also got Native Americans who claimed that land. And so the British thought was that, if they could stop this movement, militaristically stop this movement, then they can kind of keep the Americans hemmed in along the coast. And even if they didn't win the war per se, they would still control this area here. So you had guys like George Rogers Clark and a few of those others that led, really led brigades. I'm not a military guy, but led, militias might be a better word for what they used, but led a lot of those guys. And a lot of them were Virginians, but a lot of them were already here in Kentucky. And they went, there wasn't a whole lot of fighting, I think, in Kentucky, but in Indiana and Illinois in particular, near the Ohio River, the Americans were able to defeat them. And in reality, George Rogers Clark doesn't get mentioned often as a Revolutionary War general of great renown, but, he's probably one of the 3 or 4 most important ones just because of, what he did sort of kept the West open for further American settlement. So, and that, as important as Valley Forge and as important as, Yorktown, I mean, Vincennes and Kaskaskia are just as important.
Yeah, it's another good role or good thought of how Kentucky kind of played a little bit more in the Revolution than people are aware of, I would say, or at least the land of Kentucky, not the state. I guess it wasn't a state yet. Another story that I stumbled upon was about was in 1785. It was about Reverend Peter Cartwright, and he came through as a boy with his group of about 200 settlers. So, I mean, that's a good number if you think about how many people are coming in to Kentucky.
Right.
But the group had been going for a long time, and they actually had like riflemen scanning the area, kind of surrounded, protect them from any Native American raids or so forth. And a guy that was on, or one of the riflemen, I guess it was a head of them. There was like 7 riflemen, or actually, I think this Baker guy might have been in his own hunting party. But he stumbled upon the group and was like, I was with 7 riflemen, and there were 7 Native Americans. 6 of the riflemen, my colleagues or my guys died. I'm the only one left. 6 of the Native Americans died, and there's 1 Native American still alive. And I wasn't able to get to him, and he was wounded and all this, and it kind of spooked the travelers. And they were in Rockcastle mainly because they were about 7 miles from Crab Orchard. So the thought became, hey, should we go on or should we make camp now? And majority of them said, let's just truck on through the night, and we'll get to Crab Orchard, where there is a station and some protection, which they're referring to, William Whitley. I think there's the Whitley station and a few other stations, in and around Crab Orchard that they wanted to get to. Some of them, however, stayed behind, and there was probably, I don't really know the number exactly, but more than, I would say, 10 or 20 of them or so said, we're going to go ahead and set up shop and camp here. All of them, excluding 2 or 3, were massacred by Native Americans. And the few survivors were like, there's supposedly a guy who left his kids and his family and just ran off, didn't protect them or nothing like that. There was just a few other survivors that were able to get to Crab Orchard eventually and tell the tale of what had happened. So again, things were still happening as far as Native American attacks and so forth. Not as relevant as they had been before, but they were still something that the travelers were definitely fearful of.
So you mentioned this Cartwright guy, and I think that's another little area that we might want to go down just a little bit. He was young when he came through at the time, but he eventually becomes a preacher.
Yeah.
And he was a Methodist preacher. And the Methodist Church, which, obviously still exists today, the Methodist Church really, it came from Britain, but it had a lot of success in Virginia, North Carolina, but especially out into Kentucky and Tennessee, what we call the Second Great Awakening, the circuit riders, and these preachers would ride, from town to town. And the Methodist Church was very strong in this part of, in our sort of area. So when we think about the explorers that came through, if the explorers come first and then their families come second, it's only fitting that the church comes next, because there had to be some sort of religion for those people. And the Methodist Church, and even today, in many ways, if you drive around Kentucky, almost most of the towns you go to in Kentucky, there will be a Baptist church, but that makes sense because it's the biggest denomination that exists. In most places, you'll see either like a Church of Christ or a Christian church, and then you'll see Methodist churches. And even though in most of the country, the Methodist Church is not, it's died down a lot. It's still really strong in Kentucky, and a lot of it was those early preachers that sort of came through. I'm just reading this right now. What's crazy about Cartwright is he ends up in Illinois and loses an election to Abraham Lincoln. So he ran for U.S. Representative from Illinois, and he loses to Abraham Lincoln, or runs for Congress. I'm sorry, and so it's like it's just a random set of stories.
That is. Who knew Abraham Lincoln's challenger was trekking through Rockcastle as a boy? That's pretty interesting. So we move on to another little excerpt that I found was about this Bishop Asbury. I'm saying that right? And I wonder.
Yeah. And that's actually kind of why I mentioned that, was because he's Methodist. This is where Asbury College in.
Well, that's what I say. Is this I didn't know for sure, but I was like, this guy could be the guy. But anyway,
it's just a steady run of Methodist Church coming through Eastern Kentucky.
But anyway, this guy came through, and he did not have what you would call positive comments about Rockcastle, and at the time this would have been Mount Vernon area. In the book, it refers to it as Rockcastle Station. So I'm not exactly 100% sure exactly where in the county it was. I'm assuming more towards or around Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon area. But his quote was, "Where we found such a set of sinners as made it next to hell itself." So I don't know what was going on at the Rockcastle station, but it does not sound like it was very befitting to a bishop, at least. So I don't know. Rockcastle does in some places have a rough name, so I don't know.
Funny.
But anyway, around that time though, around 1792, this is when a bunch of public funds, and this is interesting because this was like publicly done. Like, they wanted funds, and the public contributed to help improve the road from Crab Orchard all the way to Powell's Valley. Now, if people aren't familiar about Powell's Valley, where would Powell's Valley be at, Daniel?
You're talking about if you go back through Virginia, back it's not through Virginia, but back through like the Cumberland Gap to Virginia. Powell Valley is sort of what would turn north. So I imagine the best way to describe it is if you were coming from Pennsylvania down the mountain to Cumberland Gap, that's going to take you through Powell Valley. We talk about the Cumberland Gap. We talk about like Daniel Boone. Boone came from North Carolina, so it's almost like if you think about like 2 points coming together at the Cumberland Gap. So there were so many people coming into Kentucky, or there had to be better roads because they were basically buffalo trails. And people were coming in, and by this point, the war's over. So the government is trying to kind of step up and build what we would what they would have seen as a road right there. And it was one of those things that you absolutely needed, and then once you needed it, then you see the population just skyrocket after that.
And then, this is 1792, so this is when Kentucky has become a state, and you got like Skaggs Trace was the main route in Rockcastle. But when they did this improvement and trying to make the trail more navigable, they kind of altered the route. They didn't go strictly on the Skaggs Trace route, and they ended up going through what would become Mount Vernon. And that's kind of where you think of geography and how infrastructure or a road can change history. By having this new road or this new path and going more through Mount Vernon, it then becomes Mount Vernon becomes the main city and so forth.
And this is where Kentucky becoming a state becomes a big deal right here. These trails, like we just mentioned, these trails that they came in on were they were path of least resistance, whatever the animals had went on. By the time you actually have public money, by the time you have a little bit of money given by the state to build a road, you don't necessarily have to lay it over that. You can maybe pick a slightly better spot. You couldn't do that as a long hunter coming in because you're just trying to get from point to point B. And so even now we see that with building of roads. Every road that's built is an improvement on the one that was there, and that's what these roads. That's why Skaggs Trace gets altered, is because let's be honest, Skaggs Trace was probably terrible compared to what the new one's going to be.
Do we really want to go around this whole mountain cliff, or could we just go this way instead? It'd be a little easier. Right. Of course, they're going to say, which
right. And I think you see there too the difference in a group of men walking in and maybe families on wagons pulling stuff coming in. A trail that might work for me and you walking individually doesn't work for a wagon coming through.
Well, and that's the big thing. These people are rolling in on wagons, pack mules, whatever they can get to carry themselves in or to get their stuff in. I mean, they're not bringing their whole house or anything, but they're bringing as much as they can, and it's not easy to do unless you have a good path to go. A few other things, and I looked up the population. Of course, it's hard to get the population of Rockcastle at, say, the year of 1810 because there's no census or nothing like that. So I looked at the year of 1820 when the first census of Rockcastle was taken, and it said there's 2,249 citizens in Rockcastle. So it'd be 10 years after it was established. Now, I looked in the book, one of the books I had, and it mentioned that there was about 2,100 in the year of 1810, but I gotta think that there's some sort of, that cannot be too accurate. I would kind of think that the population would increase a lot more from the year it was founded to, say, 10 years later. But
right.
Again, I don't, the site, it's not really referenced in the book. So in 10 years, there was at least about 2,200 people in Rockcastle. That's just a reference number, I guess. Of course, the population has grown. I think now there's about 17,000, I think now.
Okay.
When you think of that, though, you think it's only grown 17,000 in 200 years. That's not but you know, it is rural Kentucky and so forth. But I found these other stories about the county line, and I found this was very interesting, because pretty much the county line was all taken care of whenever, for the most part, whenever the county was formed, except for one part over near when Laurel County was formed. Because when Laurel County was formed, a little bit of Rockcastle was taken for that. However, there was this big room.
And a little bit was taken for Jackson County.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Just little slivers.
Can't forget about Jackson. So this county line was made, and there's a rumor that it was changed, the one in Laurel County, or the one next to Laurel County, because supposedly a legislator, a politician, lived on the county line. And back, I don't know exactly the date, but Rockcastle voted to go dry. And this person, this legislator, lived in Rockcastle on the Rockcastle side of the line. So he then petitioned to get it changed so that he would still be in Laurel County, because he wanted to sell alcohol from his house. So you're talking about your personal interest, but that's the rumor. I don't know if that was true or not. But
well, as opposed to selling it behind the house, like they probably did in Rockcastle for 200 years.
yeah. But another,
probably still do, I guess.
The sale of alcohol is very interesting, because there was a boat on the river that would sail to the one side of the river, the Laurel County side of the river, or it would sail over to the Rockcastle side of the river, depending on, I guess, if somebody was watching, or if somebody wanted booze, they would go to the side that it was legal for them to do that. It's very
interesting. On the water.
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned it just a minute ago, but Langford Station.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's the name. That's the original name for Mount Vernon, right?
Yes, that is.
That's the fort, or they usually call them stations, but they're in Kentucky. A lot of them are called stations, but they were really forts, sort of stops along the way. And so I'm doing a little research on the side here. It says that the original log cabin still exists, and it's now behind the county courthouse in Rockcastle County. Is this an accurate statement?
I don't know. I need to find out, because the book talks about it a lot too. Says that the book was written. John Lyer was, he died in 75 or something like that. But he mentions it a lot, that it's still standing. However, I don't.
So it says there, what I'm reading, it says that it was originally located just south of town on the east fork of the Skaggs Creek. Mm-hmm. And so I guess they moved it at some point into behind the county courthouse or whatever. But, it's interesting to note, that a lot of places got their name originally, and Mount Vernon sort of comes by their name a little later. I don't know if you're getting into that one tonight, but that's a big difference going from Langford Station to Mount Vernon. That's a big change in the name.
Yeah. And I need to get that confirmed, because growing up in Mount Vernon, I've never heard of, hey, the original first house or anything like that. Is never
right.
And being with my mom being such a kind of history buff and genealogy and all that stuff, I would assume I would get that at some point, but I don't know. I got to confirm it, and if I confirm it, I will confirm it if I can. But we're just talking about the original settling of the county and the houses. I want to mention, because it's so important to all these counties, is the courthouses. the courthouses were a big deal. And we mentioned in the last podcast about how, when you get these courthouses, it's like, hey, let's go over to Frank's house. He's got a house. It's got 2 rooms. It could be the courthouse.
Right.
Well, once the county is formed, about a year later, the county has come up with enough money to build a courthouse, and they built a courthouse up, about, I think it was 2 stories, which I thought was pretty impressive, to have a 2-story courthouse in 1811. And it actually served the county until 1873 when it burnt to the ground. Now, that's all that part of it, but it gets a bit fishy about why it burnt to the ground, because the courthouse burned to the ground. And it's unsure if the county clerk's office was in the courthouse as well. But that burnt to the ground. All this stuff kind of burnt to the ground within this year period, if not closer together. And it's all suspected that it's arson, and that the person who burnt the places down because there was incriminating evidence in the courthouses and the county clerk's office to do so, or to do that, which is a pretty crazy story when you think about it. However, what's even more crazy is the person who supposedly did this was indicted and trialed, but was not was not found guilty. And to make things even crazier, later on in the future, this guy became the county judge executive. So I don't really know exactly who this person was, because the book did not mention it. But I'm going to try to figure out who it was, because that is a pretty compelling story to say that they, some shady stuff, some shady political stuff. Yeah.
It's funny when you talk about courthouse fires. Those happened in so many places, and that's because, like you said, those early courthouses in many cases weren't anything more than kind of what we would call a wooden shack. Back then, it would have been a wooden mansion. Yeah. But, they might have just been a 4-bedroom or a 4-room wooden house. Well, that'll be, that's better than anybody's got. Yeah. And those things certainly were prone to fire, were prone to burning. There's a really good website. It's through the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. And it has every county and every, if they had a fire or a flood or some kind of disaster at their courthouse, and 2/3 to 3/4 of the counties have had something like that. Yeah. And it's inevitable that something like that, because the courthouses where all the business happened, everybody was there. People were smoking cigarettes. They had fire, candles, all that. Yeah. I mean, it was fire everywhere. Yeah. It's amazing that it didn't happen even more. Yeah. Yeah. And then too, in the Civil War, I know they burnt courthouses during the Civil War, and I mean, one of those things, you'd have the North burn a courthouse, well, then the South would burn a courthouse too. And, oh yeah, we'll show you, we'll burn us another one. And really, travesty in its own, because that's a big thing with Rockcastle. I mean, think about this: from 62 years of its history was all documentation was in the courthouse, and it all goes up, and that's what gets real murky. The difference between a county like Lincoln County, who courthouses never burnt, all documentation's there. Sure. This is Rockcastle, whose courthouse is burnt once, if not twice. I think the second courthouse may have burned as well. It was built in 1875, but I'm not 100% sure if it burnt or they just built a new one, because I'm just not sure about that exactly. So just to kind of put a bow on your point about courthouse fires during the Civil War, there were 27 courthouses burned between 1861 and 1865, including 15 in 1864. Now, there's odds are that a few of those were probably natural disasters, not natural, you know what I mean? They just happened, accidental. But you can probably guess that 15 to 20 of those were purposefully set, by either the Union Army or the Confederate Army. And today that makes what we're doing difficult, because just everything disappeared with that. Like, it was all gone. You know, all of your records, that's where everything was kept, and you lost all of that due to those fires. So that's kind of a sad part of what happened.
Yeah, and it like you said, it just makes it a little bit more murky. You don't want to be on the fence about things, but you kind of have to, because you don't know. We weren't there. We can't really say either or. But yeah, another interesting thing I just found, and this is probably, we'll probably end on this one, was a $2 fine for carrying fire near a mill. I thought that's a pretty hefty fine for the time, I guess, but understandable as well, because again, you don't want to burn anything down carrying fire around.
Well, then, if you look at it that way, there may have been a fine for having a fire near a courthouse, so we don't have that, but what's more valuable to the community, the courthouse or the mill? Probably the mill. That's where the food's coming from. That's where your flour and all that comes from. So it's like, we can afford a few records. We can, if there's some stuff in there that proves me guilty, let it burn. Yeah. But I still need to eat. So let's keep the mill. Let's keep the mill as is.
Yeah. Well, that's all I got, I guess. That should wrap up, I guess, our Rockcastle part. Next time we get together and talk about Rockcastle, we will definitely focus on Mount Vernon and so forth. And again, if we got, there's a bit more about Mount Vernon as far as 18 or 1789 to 1810, because those records were a bit more well kept. But then from then on, we'll talk about a few churches that were established in Mount Vernon. And so forth, but it's the county seat, so it's the biggest city. We'll get into it. There's a lot more to talk about Mount Vernon as well. Anything else you got to add there, Mr. Hopkins?
No, it's just it's enjoyable to do this, and it's enjoyable to learn a lot about Rockcastle. I'm riding on your research, and I'm trying to snag a little bit on my own here and there, but it's interesting to learn about these counties, and I think we talked about it last week as well. Just it would have been super difficult to have lived at this time.
Yeah.
These people were crazy brave in what they did, and maybe just crazy in general, but the legacy that those people left, and like we addressed at the beginning, their names still exist, and we may not necessarily know those people, but those people have been, those last names that you mentioned, those are people that have been beneficial to Broadhead and Mount Vernon and Rockcastle County for 200 years, and the county wouldn't be the same without them. So even though you maybe don't know their first name, there's still significant features in the county.
Yeah, and again, that connection. Getting that connection to your county, it just it makes it more special, and so forth. We you always, at least as far as Kentuckians go, you always remember your hometown. So with that though, we'll wrap this one up. You can connect to the podcast at KY History Pod on Facebook or Twitter. You can email us too at thelandbetweenthemetals@gmail.com. You can find Mr. Hopkins here at D_Hopkins9.
No, D_Hopkins_9.
There you go.
There you go. Let me check this.
So with all that being said, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.